Greetings, everyone. Welcome to Anime Octopus. Today, we continue our discussion on the intriguing fanfic topic. What if Naruko kissed her sensei? Part 2. Disclaimer: the content presented on this channel is intended solely for entertainment and discussion purposes. I do not claim ownership of any anime footage used in my videos. All rights and credits belong to their respective creators and copyright holders. Let's dive in. On the fourth occurrence, Kakashi was jolted awake by a persistent knocking at his door. The sound was soft yet unrelenting, and he hesitated to respond, hoping that whoever was disturbing him at this ungodly hour might simply give up and leave. He glanced at the clock with a groan. It was 4 a.m, an hour when most reasonable people were still deep in sleep, not knocking on doors. With a resigned sigh, he slowly donned his mask and shirt, deliberately prolonging the process in a last-ditch attempt to avoid the impending disturbance. His efforts proved futile as the knocking grew more insistent and forceful, threatening to transform his mild annoyance into a full-blown headache. Reluctantly, he shuffled through his living room, suppressing a yawn as his hand grasped the doorknob. He cracked the door open just enough to see who was on the other side. The precaution proved unnecessary, as the person waiting impatiently at his doorstep immediately stumbled forward, losing her balance and practically falling into his arms. Kakashi instinctively caught her, having learned from previous incidents to anticipate her clumsiness. Her hands clenched the fabric of his nightshirt, and he briefly noted how cold her skin felt. After a moment, she looked up at him, her blue eyes reflecting the silvery glow of the moonlight. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible, as if afraid to disrupt the pre-dawn silence. Kakashi inwardly lamented the loss of his sleep, realizing this visit was far from a casual encounter. "What is it, Naruko?" he asked, ensuring she was steady on her feet before closing the door behind her to keep out the cold. If he was going to be awake, he at least wanted to be warm. As he awaited her response, he took a moment to assess her appearance. Naruko was drenched, her soaked nightgown clinging to her body and leaving little to the imagination. Kakashi swallowed hard as his gaze followed the cascade of her unbound hair, which gleamed like molten amber as it reached down to her hips. Her body trembled, reminding him of the coldness he had felt earlier. He watched her closely, impatient for the explanation she was clearly struggling to provide. Finally, through chattering teeth, Naruko began to speak. "A pipe burst in my apartment," she explained, shaking her head to dislodge the water droplets from her bangs. "It won't be fixed until later today, and it's freezing outside. My clothes are ruined, even the extra set I brought with me is soaked. Sasuke and Sakura are on a mission, Iruka Sensei isn't home, and I have nowhere else to go." She exhaled in a rush, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to preserve some warmth. "I'm sorry, I know how early it is," she sniffled, tears welling up in her wide eyes. Kakashi felt a wave of panic wash over him as the realization struck, she was about to cry. The prospect filled him with dread, stirring memories he would rather not confront. He was wholly unprepared to deal with this at such an hour. Acting on instinct, he hastily tossed some towels at the drenched blonde, grabbed her by the shoulders, and nearly lifted her into the bathroom, shutting the door behind her with a firm click. He acknowledged that his actions might have been overly abrupt, but for the moment, the immediate crisis had been averted. Hearing the shower turn on, he tried, unsuccessfully, not to think about Naruko in his bathroom, naked under the warm water. 15 minutes later, the sound of the shower ceased. Another 3 minutes passed before Naruko reappeared in his living room, still damp but wrapped in a towel. Kakashi barely registered the blush on her cheeks before his mind seemed to short-circuit. There she stood, a vision of ethereal beauty, alone with him in his apartment, clad in nothing but a towel. He silently cursed every deity he could think of for placing him in such a precarious situation, struggling to maintain what little remained of his self-control. Naruko shifted uncomfortably before him, too embarrassed to voice her request. She had no usable clothes and would not have any until the problem at her apartment was fixed. And while she was incredibly warm and very thankful to Kakashi for saving her from dying as a popsicle, she was now helpless to clothe herself. She was about to plead for another favor from her sensei, when she was stopped mid-breath as the door swung open, revealing one very shocked Hokage. While he was thankful for the distraction from his improper line of thinking, Kakashi witnessed his life flash before his eyes. The Hokage twitched, and he knew he was done for. Tsunade cast a sharp, disapproving glance between the Jounin in his pajamas and her goddaughter, who was wrapped in nothing but a towel. Her eyes narrowed with righteous indignation, and her fists clenched in anger. She aimed a forceful strike at Kakashi, but he made no attempt to defend himself. Instead, he closed his eyes, accepting the impending blow and bracing for impact. When the strike did not come, he opened his eyes to find a white towel draped over tan skin. His gaze followed the towel up an elegant arm, past a distinctive freckle and a graceful elbow, to a slender wrist and finally to 10 fingers gripping a trembling ivory fist. "No, Ba-chan," Naruko said through gritted teeth, "it's not what it looks like," as she braced herself to prevent the punch from continuing its trajectory. "Release me, Naruko," the Hokage commanded firmly. "You will comply with my order." "I will not," Naruko growled in response. "He helped me." "You're misunderstanding the situation. If you would just calm down for a moment, I'll explain everything, but I won't let you harm someone who came to my aid." The sincerity in her voice seemed to ease Tsunade's anger. The Hokage's fist relaxed, and she released her grip. "Explain yourself, Naruko." "You have 1 minute before I resume my course of action," Tsunade demanded, crossing her arms. Naruko offered Kakashi an apologetic glance before focusing on her explanation. She detailed the events of the morning and how she ended up in the living room wrapped in only a towel. Meanwhile, Kakashi, feeling uneasy about Tsunade's temper, retreated to his bedroom with the intention of leaving the village. Despite his misgivings, his sense of duty to his student prevailed, and he returned with one of his old shirts in hand, ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. Naruko expressed her gratitude with a brief, appreciative embrace, her other hand clutching the towel to keep it secure. Kakashi was momentarily enveloped by the soothing scents of the forest and wildflowers, which calmed his nerves. However, the respite was fleeting as he remained vigilant, glancing warily at Tsunade. As Naruko hurriedly retreated to the bathroom to change, Tsunade closed the distance between herself and Kakashi. Her expression shifted from confusion to a warm smile, her eyes reflecting a mix of appreciation and resolve. She reached up, ruffling Kakashi's hair with a laugh, signaling her change of heart. "Apologies, Kakashi-kun," she said with a light laugh at his astonished expression. "I regret jumping to conclusions so hastily. When it comes to Naruko, I tend to be somewhat overprotective." She punctuated her apology by gently tapping his nose with her finger. As he struggled to process her whirlwind of emotions, she surprised him further. Her hand moved to adjust the collar of his nightshirt, an act of familiarity that completely disarmed him. "You're a good man, Kakashi-kun," she said, patting the area above his heart, "you have my approval." With that, she departed, the soft click of the door closing marking her exit. Kakashi sank into his couch, feeling defeated as he grappled with the significance of her words. He was so absorbed in his own thoughts that he momentarily forgot about the blonde Jinchuriki in his home. When her golden hair suddenly appeared in his field of vision and her sunlit fingers lifted his chin, he was jolted from his reverie. "Thank you, Sensei," she said with a smile, reaching for his hand. Kakashi nodded, still disoriented by her presence in his nightshirt, which fell to mid-thigh and hung loosely from her shoulders, revealing her collarbones and the curve of her neck. The sight reminded him of her lips against his throat, and he suddenly recalled a certain list. He swallowed hard, attempting to mask his discomfort with a cough, grateful that she seemed unaware of his internal struggle. A persistent tug brought him back to reality as she guided him to his feet. He regarded her with curiosity while she offered a sheepish smile. Before she could speak, a rumble from her stomach caused her to blush with embarrassment. Kakashi found her reaction endearing and led her to the kitchen. He stifled a smile as she took a seat, eagerly awaiting her meal. He had prepared enough for 4, considering Naruko's hearty appetite. A plate of bacon, eggs, and potatoes was placed in front of her, and she quickly expressed her gratitude before diving into the food. Kakashi removed his mask, now unnecessary given recent events, and noticed the familiar flush on her cheeks. He mused that she must remember, hiding his amusement behind a sip of coffee. As he enjoyed his own portion, he realized that this was not an unpleasant way to start the day. Their conversation flowed easily, and they soon became engrossed in discussing their respective adventures. Kakashi refilled their coffee cups as Naruko recounted her and Jiraiya's escapades. In turn, he shared stories of his exploits with Minato, and she listened with rapt attention. By the time Kakashi stood to clear the plates, it was well past noon. Naruko was contentedly twirling her hair as she spoke of the lessons she still needed to complete before assuming the role of Hokage. Kakashi reminded her of her ability to create numerous clones, each capable of reading a book, which would allow her to finish quickly. He was taken aback by the sudden tension in her shoulders, which contrasted sharply with her previous demeanor. In an instant, Naruko slammed her hands on the table and stood up with fervent determination. "I will not," she declared emphatically, "take the easy way out on this one, Sensei. I must dedicate the time, effort, and energy necessary to understand every aspect. One cannot be Hokage if they cut corners." Kakashi stood before her, wide-eyed. Her gaze was as unyielding as hardened sapphires, her lips pressed into a firm line, and her posture accentuated the sharpness of her words. Yet, an amusing piece of bacon dangled from one of her bangs. In a moment of levity, he imagined her at a diplomatic summit, striking the same resolute pose but with a remnant of breakfast entangled in her golden hair. The absurdity of the image prompted a spontaneous and resounding laugh that filled the room. Despite her role as a world savior capable of averting disasters and defying insurmountable odds, Naruko could not manage to keep food out of her hair. The sight was too much for Kakashi, and he doubled over, his laughter echoing through the space, the dirty dishes neglected as he clutched his stomach in mirth. Naruko felt the rigidity leave her spine as she tried to recall a time when Kakashi had ever laughed so freely. He would chuckle or cough, but never with such unguarded and genuine mirth. The scene, with dirty dishes scattered between them and sunlight casting a warm glow over Kakashi's joy, struck her as profoundly beautiful. It was pure, unrestrained happiness, and the room seemed to shimmer with a surreal quality. She wished she could freeze this moment forever. Her gaze softened, and she felt a shift in her heart. Her world seemed to place him at the zenith of her existence, as if the movements of the wind and sea suddenly aligned. The darkness she had endured since birth was now bathed in the silver light of the moon. At that moment, she realized there was something she desired more than the title of Hokage. With careful deliberation and a gentle touch, Naruko climbed onto the table on her knees and maneuvered the plates to close the distance between them. As Kakashi's hand rose to wipe away tears of joy, her own hands gently intercepted. His hand fell to his side in silent surrender while hers continued their ascent. One hand found its place behind his jaw, near his ear, while the other rested on his cheek. Her thumb caught a falling tear and softly traced his cheekbone. In the briefest of moments, her lips met his, and for the first time in her life, she felt complete. She pulled away, and although Kakashi's eyes sought hers, she was already standing, turning to gather the dirty dishes. He struggled to articulate the burning need and longing he felt to stay close to her, to hold her in his arms and keep her safe within his heart. But as she turned her back to him, tending to the sink with the only sound being the running water, he was left at a loss for words. He fumbled for a way to transition from the moment to something more stable but found himself speechless. Ultimately, he chose to follow her lead. He collected the remaining dishes and joined her at the sink. She extended her arm, silently requesting the plates he held. He placed them in her hands as if offering a gesture of peace, and she accepted with a nod. As she began to hum a song reminiscent of Kushina's old melodies, Kakashi was momentarily halted. The tune evoked memories of his childhood, of Kushina singing in Minato's kitchen. He saw her smile, a reflection of Naruko's own, as she recited the recipe. He reached out, desperately trying to cling to the fleeting happiness, but Kushina faded, merging into the image of the sunlit, blue-eyed Naruko before him. Overwhelmed, he felt as though he was drowning in a sea of memories, like a ghost from his past reappearing. The sorrow lodged in his throat, and he struggled to reconcile his past with the present, knowing it was a struggle that might well undo him. Naruko could feel the turmoil emanating off of Kakashi, but she could not fathom the cause to the drastic change in his demeanor. Anxiety threatened to undo her calm facade, but something in the way his fingers trembled just the slightest steadied her. Kakashi appeared remarkably youthful, his wide eyes betraying an intense inner turmoil that he struggled to conceal. He seemed like a storm unleashed, in need of grounding. Recognizing this, she responded instinctively, reaching up with gentle fingers to smooth the furrows from his brow. Her touch elicited a visible softening in his demeanor, easing some of the rigidity from his posture. She offered a reassuring smile and a sigh of relief, then requested the soap, hoping it would alleviate the remaining tension in his shoulders. He blinked, as if emerging from a daze, and handed her the bottle, surprised at how comforting such a simple act felt. The weight of previous moments dissolved into a sense of camaraderie, bringing Kakashi tranquility. Half an hour later, Naruko, now dressed in freshly dried clothes she had brought earlier, prepared to return to her apartment, which had been repaired. She paused at the doorway and embraced Kakashi. "Thank you," she whispered into his chest. "Truly, thank you. You didn't have to help me today, especially so early. But I'm genuinely grateful." His arms encircled her in a reassuring embrace, and he held her as long as she allowed. When she began to pull away, he placed his hands on her shoulders and bent to meet her gaze. Their eyes, gray meeting azure, conveyed his sincerity. "I promised to help you," he reminded her softly. "I meant it, Naruko." Leaning forward, he pressed a kiss to her forehead, compelled by an unspoken affection he couldn't quite restrain. The connection in the kitchen had anchored him, and he wasn't ready to let go. Seizing the moment, she slipped her hand into his pocket and tugged, pulling him away from their intimacy. He was startled but quickly followed as she bridged the gap and captured one of his hands between hers. With a mischievous smile, she transported them both to her apartment. He landed awkwardly in a pile of damp clothes, struggling to maintain his composure as he extricated himself from the mess. He looked up at her, helpless, while she giggled at his predicament. "Help me with this, then," she laughed. "Please, Sensei?" Pleased with her cleverness, she realized she had not only shifted his focus from past troubles but had also secured his assistance in tidying her apartment. Her satisfaction was evident, though it proved short-lived as a wet sweater flew toward her, drenching her hair. "If you have time to stand there and laugh," Kakashi's voice was dry, "you might as well be useful while doing it." "We don't have all day, Naruko." Suppressing her amusement, Naruko helped him out of the tangled, waterlogged laundry. She quickly fetched a basket and grinned up at him as she folded the clothes. "Gomen, Sensei," she said, smiling, "I really appreciate your help with this situation." She dodged another flying piece of clothing before succumbing to a fresh bout of giggles. Kakashi, masking his frustration, refocused on the task. As he navigated her apartment, he stole glances at her. The setting sun cast a warm glow on her hair and softened the blue of her eyes, bathing her in a light that rendered her almost ethereal. He fought the urge to touch her to confirm her reality, instead finding solace in the sound of her humming, which evoked fond memories rather than past turmoil. At 6 p.m, Kakashi resolved to assist her with many more cleaning tasks for the sake of moments like these. She caught his gaze and smiled, the kind she reserved only for him. She was radiant, even as she was now, kneeling amidst piles and piles of laundry with her unbound hair shimmering in the light of the setting sun. Yes, he thought, give him 1,000 early mornings and 1,000 more messes, he would partake in them all so long as she was in them. The 5th time it happened, Tsunade's voice all but erupted around Kakashi's name as she summoned him to her office. He heaved a heavy sigh before extricating himself from the shadows to move to open the door. When the door did not give way to his insistent push, he added more force to his flattened palm and clenched his jaw with the effort. Frustration bit at his shoulders as he wished, not for first time that day, that he had stayed home and feigned illness. Anything, he groaned, would have been better than the hassle he was dealing with now. He could hear Tsunade's string of curses, but her voice seemed stifled and he could not reason why. Another hushed voice spoke in whispers, quick in its urgency, but though it was familiar, he could not put an owner to it. He ground his teeth against one another and put more pressure on the door as the wood gave slightly to his strength. It would not be the first time that the door to the Hokage's office had been broken, but he did not want to pay for the damages that would arise from it happening on his behalf. Kakashi's patience wore thin. Money could be damned, he consented, and his hand folded into a fist. In an attempt to vent all of his frustration, the door splintered beneath the punch that rioted against it. A startled yelp resounded in his eardrums, and in the quickest act of familiarity, Kakashi's arms circled around the falling form, steadying her in her descent. "Naruko?" he breathed, and the surprise in his voice was eminent. He straightened the two of them before hastily letting her go, thankful for the mask that hid the blush at her proximity. Hatake Kakashi did not blush, and it would be ill-suited had Tsunade borne witness to the fact that he most certainly did blush, and blush often, when it came to his sunny-haired student. Said student suddenly pressed her palms against his vest and all but shoved Kakashi towards the door frame, ushering him out of the room. He resisted, and a grunt escaped her small body as he remained unmovable before her. His eyes scanned the room and widened marginally at the sight before him. Tsunade was in her chair, held down by 6 of Naruko's clones. The 7th had her tan fingers over the Hokage's mouth, and shook her head furiously in a desperate request for the angry leader to remain silent. Tsunade's glare fell on the back of the real Naruko's head, and Kakashi knew that had Naruko seen it, she would have gulped. He, himself, was half tempted too, but was once again thankful for the years of practiced stoicism that allowed him to keep his reactions hidden. "Sensei, please," Naruko pleaded, but the headache that threatened to bloom behind his eyelids rendered him merciless. Pale fingers rose to encircle her wrists and the gentleness to the act belied his strength. Suddenly the real Naruko was faced away from him, towards the Hokage, while her arms were pinned behind her. He moved so quickly that her hair had not fallen still before his chin was on her shoulder, and with a voice as quiet and steely as a glacier, Kakashi spoke. "Naruko," he drawled, "pray explain what, exactly, is going on here?" And Naruko flinched as if ice had pooled across her spine. The hitch in her breath was satisfying for Kakashi, and he thought that perhaps today would not be such a waste after all. She did well to hide her trembling, but he was too attuned to her to not notice how much control she had to exert in order to do so. He could feel the acceleration to her pulse and the tension to her shoulders. He knew it was with determination and a wealth of stubbornness that her voice remained steady when she responded to him. "Nothing really," she said as she shrugged her shoulders for an air of unaffectedness. "Ba-chan and I were merely discussing some," she fumbled, and it immediately piqued Kakashi's interest. "Girl stuff," Naruko finished lamely, and he knew there was far more to the story than that which she had spoken of. He nodded his head anyways, as if in understanding, before a second Kakashi sprung up behind Tsunade and quickly dispelled the other Narukos. The Hokage coughed once around the smoke before rising out of the seat and storming towards Naruko. Naruko backed into Kakashi as he held her captive, and flinched against his chest when Tsunade brandished an accusatory finger in her direction. "You!" she growled as she reached for Naruko's chin. "How dare you! You do not get to use secondary sealing jutsus against your leader." And Tsunade's voice was even louder with the closeness, and felt a lot like crumbling stones. The headache that threatened to bloom before him now bore thorns. He mourned for the days of peace and quiet, when Naruko studied her books and the Hokage signed treaties. Today, he wept, was not one of those days. Naruko's ire flashed and rose from her form like heat, and Kakashi had half the mind to let her go before her own voice rang like glass in his mind. His ears were sensitive to sound, and the decibels with which the two women were arguing were too high for his liking. He mentally beseeched Naruko to retain her composure, but she did not seem to receive the signal. "I had to," she yelled, and Tsunade's glare hardened even further. "This is ridiculous. You were going to tell Hai?" And she froze, still as a statue, as her mouth fell closed with an audible snap. Kakashi eyed her sideways as he took the moment to analyze her composure. She did not move to meet his gaze, but a flush dotted her cheekbones. Her eyes shimmered with desperation as she looked into Tsunade's amber-colored orbs, and Kakashi could not help but to fall into the trap that lay before him. He knew that whatever was going on would involve him and his assistants in some way, would put more work onto his plate, and aggravate him as everything involving Naruko was wont to do. Even still, the flush and the stillness, and the overwhelming need to alleviate any of her discomfort, caused him to shift his gaze from his student to that of the Hokage. Tsunade's form went from rigid to something akin to a victor. Her glare molded into an air of mockery and satisfaction, and the grin that lingered on her lips appeared unfriendly but riddled with amusement. Her stance spelled trouble, but Kakashi regarded her anyways. "Tell me what, exactly?" he lazed, and Tsunade's smile widened. "Naruko," she intoned, and Naruko shook her head in one last attempt at begging Tsunade to remain silent. She allowed haughtiness to take reign as she claimed 1 minute of triumphant silence before she finished answering Kakashi's query. "Naruko does not know how to dance." Kakashi's mind fumbled around the Hokage's answer as he tried to establish sense to the syllables. "All of this," he faltered, the clones and the yelling and the woman practically buried against his chest, for the one shred of truth that said woman couldn't dance? What source of foolishness had sunken some of the most powerful beings in the world to this kind of ridiculousness? He spared himself one astonished look at Naruko before returning the same to Tsunade, who emanated smugness in waves. "What?" was all he could muster, as incredulity had turned his other thoughts into ones too inappropriate for the Hokage's office. "Yes," she spoke around a laugh, "Naruko can't dance. And you, Kakashi, are going to teach her." At this he let Naruko go, and she did not waver from where she stood, frozen by Tsunade's order. Kakashi brought his gloved hands up before him, in a guise of surrender, before shaking his head. "I can't," he spoke hurriedly, shifting his attention between his blonde-haired student and the tawny-haired Hokage. "Tsunade, I can't. I'll find someone else, Shikamaru maybe." And Tsunade took one threatening step towards him. "Are you," she spoke with a voice bearing the edge of a blade, "are you denying a direct order from the Hokage, Kakashi?" And at this Naruko turned, her blue eyes filled to the brim with unshed tears. He wondered how often he had to bear witness to a sight like this one, her ocean-hued eyes swimming with tumultuous waves. He hitched his breath, feeling as if he were drowning, and then heard his relent to Tsunade's question before he registered that he had made the decision. "No," he sighed, "no Hokage-sama, I am not," and then Naruko wilted where she stood, and he watched as her shoulders slumped in defeat. Tsunade moved forward, and with a smile that was too brilliant for the sight of the poor girl before him, placed her hands on their shoulders and shoved them together. She stepped back and nodded her head, and the words that followed held all the finality of an ending. "Good, good," she intoned, "yes, you two will suffice. You two will open the dance at the Sakura festival this weekend," and as if she could sense his impending refusal, she cleared her throat before continuing, "I trust a week is enough time, no?" Kakashi shook his head in an attempt to reason with her, but Tsunade bore no pity. "You'll have to find a way to manage anyways, Kakashi." And that, he knew, was her cue for dismissal. Kakashi folded a steady palm against Naruko's back, guided her to the door, and exited the Hokage's office, all the while contemplating all the ways out of Konoha and whether or not he'd extend the offer to flee to Naruko. They continued on in quiet thought and wound their way to Naruko's apartment, not noticing the odd looks of the villagers that were not used to seeing the two so listless. Naruko unlocked her door without checking that Kakashi followed her in and proceeded to put on a pot to boil for some tea. It was only after pouring the 2 cups and placing one in front of Kakashi, that she acknowledged his presence at all. "Gomen, Sensei," I tried to reason with her, but she was insistent. As she spoke, she moved to sit across from him. She all but fell into her chair and then moved her hair across her shoulder before running her fingers through it, an act he knew she only did when she was anxious. She could never be still for long, and he watched as the tresses yielded to her ministrations like liquefied gold. For a moment he was breathless, stricken once again by the gold pooling in her lap. Her downcast eyes held the tinge of the night sky. They had never borne that shade of navy before, and they were swimming with trepidation. He leaned across the table to put an end to her actions, and 10 fingers found themselves enclosed within a gloved hand. She sighed before lifting her eyes to meet his own, and distantly he begrudged her need to hesitate before doing so. He was not the one who put them in this predicament, and he had a few choice words for the person who had, but both respect and obligation forced him to yield to the circumstance. "Nay, Naruko," he drawled, It isn't your fault. Tsunade just enjoys exercising her power when the days are slow. He attempted a grin, though his mask belied the effort. Naruko shook her head, her blonde bangs sashaying against her forehead before falling in place again as she spoke. That isn't it, Sensei? And her voice held the heaviness of resignation. Hinata-chan taught me to dance once. It isn't that I don't know how to, and as she continued, her fingers tightened around his own, it's just that I can't. Not in front of everyone, not with them watching me. Kakashi did not miss the slight rise to her voice, nor did he fail to notice the increase of pressure against his palm. He brushed his thumb against the back of her hand in an attempt to comfort her. He begrudged Tsunade not for the first time that day, and he ground his teeth when he realized it wouldn't be the last. His following words were devoid of the frustration, and instead bore all the care that he could muster. Now, Naruko, he soothed, you know you can do anything. You've proven that more times than I can count. At this, Naruko unwound her fingers from Kakashi and rose from her seat. Her hands knotted themselves into her hair and clenched, and the strain of such an act was evident on her knuckles. Her barely restrained strength worried him, as he was rather fond of her tresses and did not want them uprooted from her head. She started pacing in a feeble attempt to vent some of her stress, and her teeth ground around the effort of addressing him. Sensei, she growled, this isn't a matter of protecting anyone, this, and at this moment, much to Kakashi's relief, she unwove her hands from her hair in order to wave them around in exasperation. This is ridiculous. This is parading me around in front of everyone in some stupid dress and some stupid heels and just waiting for me to fall. Her voice was an octave higher now and grated on his ears. He hit a flinch as he unraveled himself from his own seat. He eyed her warily, slightly unnerved at her wild ministrations before he silently moved towards her. Her right hand arced over his head and he caught it in its descent, his pale fingers secured around it in order to keep it prisoner. She turned, startled at his speed, and nearly bumped into him. Seizing the opportunity, his other hand brushed along the small of her back, pressing her closer into his frame. A quiet eep whispered against his chest as her left hand fell upon his shoulder. And, like a flame to candle wax, Naruko melted beneath his touch. He ignored the shrill of victory that reverberated in his spine and instead tucked Naruko's head beneath his chin. He reveled in the smallness of her stature, how her lips whispered against his throat and her breath ghosted across his skin. Kakashi shifted his weight and Naruko responded, stepping backwards to his gentle lead. They continued like this in quiet succession, and the repetition molded her closer against him. For what seemed like an eternity, they swayed back and forth, two specters dancing in the light of a setting sun. He pulled back from her for just a moment, and she lifted her chin to meet his gaze. The fading light haloed around her form and sunk into the golden strands of her hair, gilding it with all the hues of an ember. Her eyes shimmered with captured light and held the depth of the Caspian Sea. Her lips were tainted rose, her cheeks were stained crimson. He envied the sun for its closeness to her skin and longed to press his lips to it in order to douse her with shadows. She was resplendent and outer-worldly, and he knew he was lost to her forever. He felt the full weight of defeat in those eyes, for though she was caged in his embrace, she held the entirety of his heart in her hands. He watched as her eyes fell closed and soon found that his resolve fell with them. Between one heartbeat and the next, his mask was around his neck and his lips were on hers, gentle and soft as petals. She sighed into him and it sounded more like a breath of relief, and it was not lost on him. Her hands had moved to his chest and clenched the supple leather of his vest, and it was all the anchor he needed. The hand at the small of her back splayed and increased its pressure, forcing every inch of her to press into him, and it still was not close enough. His other hand wove around the base of her neck, entangling itself in her hair. She rose to deepen the kiss and he lost control. He wanted more, needed more, and soon he found her mouth opening to his own. His brain turned to mush. He had never been so undone before, never felt as if his veins were replaced with live wire. Every inch of his skin that touched hers felt as if it was being burned, and he could not find it in him to care. She could turn him to naught but ash and he would thank her, worship her, and beg her to do it again. She breathed his name and it tasted like hallelujah on his tongue, and he was never one to be religious, but there was glory in the way she responded to his touch. She gasped and he pulled back, forgetting oxygen in the haze of his emotions. Her eyes were glazed over, her face was flushed, and his heart hammered behind his ribs. Distantly he wondered if she could feel it before realizing that the sun had finished setting. She was more luminous than blazing now that the gray of twilight had pooled across her skin. He leaned down for another kiss, and stole one, two, and a third before taking a step back. Every ounce of him mourned the distance, but he doubted his capability to restrain himself if she remained so tantalizingly close to him. Her hands relaxed on his chest and he bent his forehead to hers in an attempt to regain his composure. He wanted to keep her like this forever, folded in his arms. Safe, sound, and so damn beautiful that it nearly broke his heart. She smiled up at him through hooded eyelashes and a wealth of happiness washed over him. He flashed her his own grin, and felt as she gulped at the sight of him. He appreciated the effect he had on her, cherished it, and for a moment the world spun in leisure peacefulness before her lips parted and she spoke around the silence. "Nay, Sensei," she giggled, "I'm not so certain this is what Hokage-sama had in mind." And as the playfulness took reign over the situation, Naruko vanished from his arms before he could anticipate her trickery. He inelegantly stumbled forward twice before regaining his footing and turned haphazardly in the direction of her voice. A millisecond later, and she was perched on the countertop, her head titled sideways in a mock of innocence. The flush was still evident along her collarbones, but otherwise both had seemed to regain enough propriety to forestall any further complications to their relationship. He stood up straight and arced a long arm behind his own hair, sweeping his hand along the back of his head in order to feign his own ease. It was a gesture she had known well, what he had adopted to stall heady circumstances and allow for enough time to come up with an escape plan. He knew she recognized the act and had no wish to misalign the events they shared, and as such he offered a bow to the woman bracing herself in the kitchen. "Shall we try again, Naruko?" At this, her head straightened and she stiffened as if she sensed a trap. "Practice makes perfect, after all," he drawled, and before she could shake her head no, he had already grabbed her from off the counter and adjusted her into something akin to a waltz. Naruko was not one to be offset and had an abundance of annoyance to expel. Soon there were 5 of her and in response, Kakashi created 5 clones to partner with them and copy his and her movements. Sensing a challenge afoot, Kakashi rendered 11 more shadow clones. She acquiesced to his challenge and pretended an air of indifference, however Kakashi experienced far too many of her pranks to ever fall for such guile. They had just finished a set of twirls before Naruko inundated her apartment with well over 100 clones. The number continued increasing until he was body to body with all of his clones and suffering under the force of maintaining the copies. The pressure increased unbearably so, and he dispelled them in puffs of smoke before falling to his knees and gasping for breath. Only then did Naruko take mercy on him and eradicate the rest of her copies. She held a steady palm out to him but he declined the offer. He wrapped his hand around her own and instead went backwards. His velocity forced her with him and soon they were laying side by side on her wood floor. Her head rolled onto his shoulder, and the two found themselves bathed in the light of a waning moon. For a minute, Naruko was speechless as Kakashi doused in all the hues of silver was enough to make him appear impermanent. She felt as though one blink would remove him from her skies entirely, as if he was composed of starlight, as if he could fall from her forever. As such, she felt the need to fold one arm against his chest in a desperate attempt to assure herself of his heartbeat. Only then did she relax against his form, and the process did not go unnoticed by Kakashi. "Do you?" She paused as if tasting her words. "Do you really feel up to this, Kakashi?" And for the first time in a very long time, Kakashi found himself unwilling to hesitate. His response was instantaneous. His voice was as weightless though he spoke with such gravity. "Of course," he exhaled, "we've witnessed the world as it fell to its knees, why can't we bear this, too?" He chuckled, a light and airy sound. "Naruko, you saved the planet and all those in it, and you wrought love where hatred once reigned. You are the epitome of hope." At this, he pressed a quiet kiss to her temple. "You are the symbol of beginning, of renewal, of persistence. You could dance like a chicken and people would watch." He smiled then, and she felt his grin as it formed against her skin. After losing loved ones in the war, the villagers need these festivals to help them continue. They need you to guide their growth. I will be here to help you rise to their necessity. You can falter and I will steady you. I will not change my role in your life, regardless of circumstance. Naruko settled herself into his form, closed her eyes, and nodded her head. Her voice was barely above a whisper when she spoke next. I need you, she confessed, and her words were sluggish with the weight of sleep. I need you. He tucked her closer against his form, and felt as his eyes fell closed before he gave them his permission. Exhaustion had caught up to him, and as sleep doused his world in darkness, his voice echoed into the abyss, I need you too. They woke the next morning in the hands of embarrassment, but soon fell into the familiarity of training. It was simple to conform to old history. Maintain a schedule, perfect moves, and utilize them when the situation necessitated it. Naruko and Kakashi practiced the routine for 5 days straight. On the 6th, they endured the grueling process of having their wardrobe set in place. On the 7th, the two of them performed in front of the entire village. To all who witnessed it, it was as peaceful as a receding tide, beauty untethered to all but gravity. Naruko glided and ebbed as if she embodied the waves, and Kakashi stepped as if he turned the earth beneath his feet. She was radiant, clothed in all the colors of the morning sky, while Kakashi bore all hues of nighttime. The two dazzled as reigning heavenly bodies. Watching them dance was akin to bearing witness to the brilliance of an eclipse, and sun met moon with the full yearning of all the hours between them. Their dance ended and the entire audience mourned for more. And though every villager eyed the two with longing, Naruko and Kakashi only beheld one another. The dance floor opened to everyone else, and the evening passed without a hitch. Naruko and Kakashi turned to Tsunade, who nodded her head in gratitude and permission for their departure. The two disappeared in a flume of smoke, sly enough to not draw the attention of anyone else. The music never faltered, the lanterns never dimmed, and many couples danced until the very beginning of dawn. For what felt like centuries, Konoha experienced one night of pristine serenity. And who better to start it but the woman who had saved Konoha in all of its entirety, and the man who had ultimately saved her. The two were sequestered away back at Kakashi's apartment. He had made both of them cups of ramen before regrettably offering her some of his old clothes for pajamas. She readily agreed and scrambled into the bathroom to shower and change. When she came back into the room, Kakashi hit a gulp. She was weaving her hands through her unbound hair in an attempt to detangle it. That which wasn't ensnared between her fingers hung tightly against her, soaking her clothes so that they stuck to her frame. Her curves caught the moonlight and shadowed the rest of her form, rendering her ethereal. He wondered how it was possible that someone could still look more beautiful now than when she was draped in intricate fabric, makeup, and hair ornaments. It was then he realized that it was because only he saw her like this, in her most unguarded state, derobed of all her boisterous personality that she showed to all others. Here with him, Naruko was more flame than wildfire. She was calm and gentle, sincere about strengths and fears, and open and honest with her insecurities. Here she wore her heart instead of her armor, and upon realizing this, he had a desperate need to shield her all over again. He walked over to her and folded her in his arms. He picked her up, startled by how slight she seemed, and brought her over to the couch. He settled her into it before leaving to grab the brush she left on his bedroom dresser all those nights ago. He returned to her and she eyed the brush with relief before extending her hand in a silent request for it. He shook his head before sitting next to her. She turned to ask him vocally for it but was silenced when he gently forced her away from him. Kakashi, she growled, frustrated at the seemingly senseless point of his actions. Her back was to him now, and he could feel the rigidity in her spine. He hid a laugh before raising the brush and running it along her strands, careful to not pull on a tangle. She flinched in surprise before relaxing into him and the soft cushions beneath her. He repeated his ministrations with tender care, admiring how soft her hair was even when it was wet. It yielded to him easily, and before too long it bore no tangles. Though his beginning task was complete, he continued his actions, relishing in the intimacy of the moment. Unbeknownst to Kakashi, Naruko had succumbed to sleep halfway through his progress. Exhausted and too comfortable to resist, she drifted off. An hour later, she murmured his name in her sleep, prompting Kakashi to respond, only to realize she was dreaming. He yawned and glanced at the clock above the door, astonished that it was already 6 in the morning. He considered moving her to his bed but decided it was best to remain as they were. Rubbing his eyes, he pulled down his mask and settled deeper into the cushions. He made one final stroke through her long hair before reclining. As he fell back into sleep, the brush slipped from his hand. Naruko awoke to the morning light and, startled, turned quickly, concerned for Kakashi. Her gaze fell on the man peacefully snoring beside her. A fond smile crossed her face as she observed his relaxed state, his mask lowered, lips slightly parted, and one hand still tangled in her hair. The brush lay on the floor beside his feet, and she stifled a laugh to avoid waking him. It was clear he had cared for her until sleep had overtaken him. Stiff from her awkward position, Naruko rose quietly to stretch and ease her joints. She faced a dilemma, realizing she likely should not make a habit of staying overnight with her sensei. Sneaking back to her own apartment and her own bed seemed the prudent choice, though she felt a pang of reluctance at the thought. She dismissed the idea with a shrug and returned to the couch, careful not to disturb Kakashi. She was taken aback by how youthful he appeared. His snow-colored hair and moonlit skin, with a subtle dusting of freckles, made him seem like a child napping in the sun, oblivious to the world around him. Her heart ached as she noticed the depth of loss in his eyes, which seemed to age him beyond his years. With a tender kiss on his forehead, careful not to let her now dry hair touch him, she curled up beside him. As she nestled into his comforting presence, Naruko realized how deeply Kakashi was embedded in her heart. Counting his heartbeat at 7 in the morning, she pondered if this was what it truly meant to be in love. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please consider subscribing to Anime Octopus for more updates and exciting videos. Your support means a lot. Thanks again, and see you next time. Anime Octopus.